Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare and life sciences. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has decades of experience serving clients in the healthcare and life sciences industries nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we will wrap up our four-part series on direct access lab testing by discussing licensing and operational considerations, as well as the future of the lab testing industry. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Megan Robertson. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our Washington, D.C. office. Throughout this series of episodes, we've talked about the growth of the direct access testing industry and the types of models developed to support the businesses that are using that type of testing. We've talked about reimbursement considerations and physician ordering and specimen collection regulation. This is the final episode of the series, and today we're covering the topic of lab licensure and other operational considerations. After that, we will close out this series by discussing some recent developments that will impact the lab developed test, or LDT, industry, and in relation, the direct access testing industry, specifically FDA's anticipated proposed rule on regulation of LDTs. Today, we have Bob Hearn back with us. Bob has been a guest on each of our direct access testing episodes in this series. Bob is a member of the firm at EBG and has an active practice advising laboratories and related businesses in various legal and regulatory contexts. Welcome back, Bob.
Thanks, Megan. Glad to be back with you and James today.
Great. And yes, as Bob says, today joining us again is James Boiani. James joined us for the first episode of this series. James is also a member of the firm at EBG with a practice focused on the life sciences industry that includes specialized experience advising on FDA-related compliance matters. Thanks for speaking with us again today, James.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's start off our discussion today by going over the licensing considerations for direct access testing models. Specifically, we're going to talk about facility licensure for laboratories. As a note, there are also personnel licensure issues to consider, but today we're going to be focusing on facility licensure. Clinical laboratories are defined by federal regulations as a facility that is for the purpose of examination of materials derived from the human body that will be providing information for the diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of any disease or impairment, or the general assessment of the health of human beings. Any lab that meets this definition is governed by the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, or CLIA, and therefore that would be subject to the CLIA certification requirements that are contained within those regulations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, is authorized by the regulations to enforce CLIA, but CMS has actually delegated this responsibility to the states to facilitate lab certification. There are different levels of lab certification depending on the complexity of the tests being conducted by the lab. It's important for listeners to understand a little bit of regulatory overlap here in that the complexity of the test itself is determined by the FDA. So Bob, can you take us through the types of CLIA certificates generally and their associated operational requirements?
Yeah, sure thing. So there are three basic types of CLIA certificates with a couple of subspecies. And after I describe them, we'll talk a little bit about which ones, in my experience, are really the most relevant to direct access testing. The most basic form of CLIA certificate is a certificate of waiver. And then there are certificates for moderate and high complexity testing. Waive tests are very simple tests that are frequently approved or cleared by the FDA as either waived from the outset or they're cleared or approved for home use. You should think about these types of tests in the associated certificate of waiver as for testing that is done very frequently at the point of care in physicians' offices. For instance, they're COVID tests, their urine dipstick tests that get performed there, basic simple cholesterol tests, rapid streps, and the like. Those are your basic sort of garden variety waive tests for which you have to have a certificate of waiver. Then there are separate certificates for moderate and high complexity testing. And as you noted, Megan, what constitutes a moderate or high complexity test is determined by the FDA. They use a set of criteria that I won't go into in any detail, but they score the complexity of the test using this criteria. And it's driven largely by the complexity of the analysis and the kind of interpretive complexity of the test. Is there additional work that needs to be done to interpret or analyze test results, particularly by laboratory testing personnel that make the test more complicated than a purely automated or machine-driven test? Those latter types tend to fall into the moderate complexity realm, and the ones that involve sort of more human interaction or subjective judgment fall into the high complexity bucket. But again, it's a somewhat complicated analysis that's performed by the FDA. Now, I said that there were a couple of subsets. These certificates, they're worth knowing about, although they don't tend to come into play very often in the direct access testing world. One is a provider performed microscopy certification. That's a subset of moderate complexity testing. And it is testing that's usually done in a physician's office on entities that can be identified through microscopic examination that are collected from a patient on site, such as fungal infections and the like. Then the one that does, I guess, have really some play in the direct access testing world is the relatively new certificate of registration. And that really is nothing more than a provisional certificate to operate while a high complexity or moderate complexity certificate is being issued. And usually the thing that's holding up the issuance of the high complexity or moderate complexity certificate is just the inspection. So once your paperwork is done, you can get a certificate of registration from CLIA. That allows you to start operating the lab subject to and contingent upon a successful inspection, either from your accrediting agency or from the state CLIA entity. So that's the basic overview. And again, in the DAT world, in my experience, most of the tests that are patient initiated fall into the moderate or high complexity buckets. And that's what most of our DAT clients are looking to set up, either moderate or high complexity CLIA certified laboratory.
Great. Thanks, Bob. And there's plenty to think about at the federal level, of course, but to add another layer here, in addition to CLIA, many states have their own individual state lab licenses that labs have to obtain in addition to the federal CLIA certificate. A subset of these states even require that out-of-state labs that are testing specimen that originated in the state must have that state's lab license. Adding just one more twist, there are two states, New York and Washington State, that are actually approved as CLIA exempt states, in that if a lab obtains a New York or Washington lab license, they do not also need to obtain a CLIA certificate because the state programs meet or exceed CLIA's requirements. So definitely a lot to think about as far as licensure goes and the scope of operations of the DAT business, which states maybe you want to start out in as far as licensure considerations go and what might be more complex than others, and then how businesses might want to expand over time. So then, aside from licenses for laboratories, the different players involved in a direct access testing model may have to obtain other facility licenses, such as specimen collection or patient service center permits. There are also mobile unit licenses and various others, depending on the state. Thinking through this aspect of the issue, Bob, how might a stakeholder putting together a direct access testing business model approach ensuring that all players in the model are appropriately licensed to support the operations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And starting a direct access testing lab operation is very complicated. And the complexity of it is often not appreciated by people that want to start such an operation. The founders of direct access testing companies come from other healthcare arena, and they are not familiar with, again, this sort of multi-layered laboratory approach. And they think that it won't be that hard to start an entity that provides direct access testing from a single lab to multiple different patients or end users in multiple different states. And for the reasons that you just pointed out, Megan, it really is extraordinarily complicated. Not only do you have to have the CLIA certificates that we talked about a minute ago, but in many states, you have to have a lab license in order to process specimens and issue test results from patients that are located even in states where the laboratory is not located. So It's really a little bit like doing a Rubik's Cube. You're trying to line up all the colors on the cube, each side the same color, and it's not always the easiest thing to do. To make matters more complicated, as you pointed out, while CLIA does not typically regulate the way in which specimens are collected or the processing of specimens outside of the laboratory, many states do have regulatory schemes that regulate how and who can collect laboratory specimens. And some states even regulate the processing of specimens for the purposes of preservation and shipment to laboratories that are located outside the state. For instance, we just worked on a project in Nevada, Megan, and they have a new law where they actually now license specimen processing facilities in Nevada, even where no analytic laboratory work is done. So this all leads to your fundamental question is, well, how do you deal with this structurally? And what we're starting to see more of is entities that will contract out most of the services that they're actually going to need or rely upon to perform a patient-initiated or direct access testing test. They will, for instance, establish a business entity that may do nothing more than provide the specimen collection or test kit to the patients in other states. And then they'll actually farm out contractually the analytical lab work, the specimen collection, if the specimen collection requires professional phlebotomy or blood drawing capabilities. They will contract out the specimen delivery systems to contract carriers. And they'll essentially just act as a central management type entity for all these different functions. And it makes it somewhat easier from a licensure perspective to operate in that manner. On the other hand, we have entities that are starting direct access testing models that are actually operational clinical labs, and they just want to add a direct access testing piece. They're already expert at performing the lab test. They know how to do it. And they will run the whole business lock, stock, and barrel because they understand the regulatory environment that they're operating in. And if they need to contract anything, there might be some remote specimen collection in places where they intend to do business. So there are different ways to structure these operations that can alleviate some of the regulatory burden while you get the business up and running. They may ultimately not be the most profitable, and you may be able to shift from a contract-based sort of service provider to a more organic, full-service laboratory operation over time. But the contract structure is not a bad way to start.
All right. And that concludes our topics that we promised to cover in our first episode. And to bring it all together, and I should say, if listeners have not listened to the full series, we highly encourage you to listen to the first 3 episodes of this direct access lab testing series. So to bring everything together today, Bob and I thought it would make sense to address some recent developments that have the potential to impact the direct access testing models and the lab industry as a whole, as I mentioned earlier. So we have James here to chat with us about this development, which, as I mentioned, is FDA's upcoming LDT proposed rule. We've discussed on prior podcasts that historically FDA has exercised enforcement discretion when it comes to LDTs, with a few exceptions. However, in recent years, both FDA and Congress have attempted to create a framework to regulate LDTs, but these attempts have not been successful to date. This year, though, FDA made a more definitive move toward regulation of LDTs. And James, can you talk us through the timeline of events here?
Sure, absolutely. Maybe I'll step back in history a little bit just to start. FDA has been asserting that it has jurisdiction over lab-developed tests for at least 3 decades. And what you saw over time is the enforcement discretion, then some carve-outs, and then in 2014, FDA put forward a proposal and guidance to lay out a framework with, I think, like a 9-year runway to get all tests in to start regulating laboratory-developed tests, similar to how they regulate IVDs or in vitro diagnostics. That proposal and guidance was pulled in 2016 after the election of the Trump administration. And since that time, there have been questions about whether FDA had moved forward, and you've seen some of this sort of piecemeal regulation For example, like pharmacogenomic tests were carved out of the LDT enforcement discretion. And you've also seen a lot of congressional action with multiple attempts to pass what is generally referred to as the VALID Act, which would create a clear statutory basis for FDA to regulate LDTs and address some concerns that have been raised about whether its statutory authority allows those tests to be reached. The most recent congressional effort came out of the Senate Help Committee at the end of the last Congress, but wasn't able to make it to the finish line. So at the end of 2022, FDA started evaluating its options and has decided to go forward with a proposed rule with regard to LDTs. What exactly that rule would say, I wish I knew. I don't know. But essentially, at a minimum, it puts a marker down where FDA is saying that they have authority to regulate LDTs under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that they're going to move forward with regulations along that line. And it should set up, at a minimum, the potential for resolving this issue in the courts or potentially bringing people back to the table with regard to regulation of lab-developed tests under a new congressional framework. So I think at this stage, FDA announced it has a proposed rule. FDA has sent that over to the Office of Management and Budget, which needs to sign off before that proposed rule is released. Office of Management and Budget is having meetings with many stakeholders who are coming in to express their thoughts about whether a rule should be released. We're waiting to see what the next step is. My guess would be that OMB will sign off on a proposed rule. Proposed rule is not going to be final, obviously, so it's not going to have the force of law, but it will continue the conversation about what comes next for LDTs. And I would think probably in the fall, maybe in the later fall, you'd see that. But at this point, OMB is being receptive to hearing from various stakeholders before that rule comes out. So that's sort of where we're at. And again, where the rule goes, it could be a very simple rule, just asserting that FDA regulates LDTs. And so at any time they can end enforcement discretion, or it could be a more comprehensive framework like they proposed in 2014, or something in between, maybe adding simple requirements like adverse event reporting or registering and listing if you're making LDTs in your lab, as there really isn't a full-scale repository that has all of that information. So there could be different approaches FDA takes, but I do think we'll probably see something come out this year, probably in the late fall.
Understanding that we don't know what's in the proposed rule exactly, how would you think stakeholders should be preparing for when the proposed rule comes out, or what should they expect once the proposed rule comes out? What should they expect to maybe need to evaluate based on whatever the contents are?
As soon as the proposed rules comes out, they should call you, me, and Bob. Yeah, but beyond that, no, I think that they really need to be prepared to take a hard look at the rule and try and think through what the impact will be to their business. Are they coming to it from the side of a lab that performs a lot of LDTs that present a considerable volume of their testing? They will want to be prepared to submit comments. I don't think that any entity should leave this strictly to larger associations. I think larger associations will drive a lot of the conversation, but it's important with these sorts of significant regulatory shifts that every stakeholder take a look and try and assess where things are going. I think another opportunity, not on the lab side, but on the in vitro diagnostic side, is for IVD manufacturers to use this as an opportunity to revisit some regulations around diagnostic tests that they manufacture. One of the concerns, the central concern really, that the lab community has raised with regard to FDA regulation of LDTs is it'll slow innovation substantially. And that is not a big leap of logic if you have to go through a lengthy approval or clearance process for a test, and you need to build the quality infrastructure you need to FDA standards and all of that, that's going to take time. It's going to take money, and it's going to have a big impact on how quickly tests can be launched in response to new science that's coming out. I think that this is a good time then for diagnostics manufacturers, both small and large, to be looking at these issues and maybe looking for a framework that facilitates innovation, both by labs that are currently performing LDTs and also by manufacturers by revisiting different approaches that can be taken. One that has been historically discussed within the IVD community has been what were called transitional IVDs. And it's probably had like 10 acronyms by now because it's been floating around for 20 years. But the general concept is that with a diagnostic, you have sort of two components. You have the analytical validity, which means I can measure what I say I measure. I want to measure protein X, and I can measure it with 99% accuracy. That's the analytical. And then there's the clinical validity, which is, okay, how do the levels of protein X that I'm measuring line up with clinical action levels? Whether I need to treat a patient with something, if it informs my diagnosis, those sorts of things. The transitional IVD model in its original conception would say, okay, you develop the test and you validate its analytical validity because you need to have a test that works. It can measure what it says it's going to measure, but then you don't have clinical validity right away. You require data to be provided within a certain number of time. Maybe it's a couple of years as the research develops to determine whether or not that transitional IVD becomes a full IVD. And if the research and maybe initially looked promising changes so that what was thought to be a great marker and now you understand is not really a great marker, those tests come off the market. That's the general concept. And it's an idea that might be one way if FDA moves forward with regulating to address some of those innovation concerns. But I think it's important to have success in this, that FDA does address those concerns, hopefully not just through some carve-outs, but really looking at whether there's a way to accelerate not IVD development, not LDT development, but diagnostics development to get these out faster, because the rate at which science is evolving, the rate at which we're learning about new markers, genetic or otherwise, is really substantial. And although there are important elements to having review and approval and processes in place and all of that, we also need to, and FDA needs to be cognizant of the fact that people do need tests quickly. I think looking at ways they can balance those interests and look for potential reforms that allows everyone to innovate could be really important, and something that IVD manufacturers may and probably should advocate for.
James, let me follow up with a quick question, if I could, on the possible regulation of LDTs by the FDA. I think from an operational perspective, one of the things our clients either are or should be concerned about, especially the smaller clients who are starting direct access testing laboratories or direct access testing businesses, is if FDA does wade in and start directly and heavily regulating LDTs, will tests that are currently being performed as LDTs be grandfathered out of the regulation in some way? Will the labs be able to continue to perform LDTs for a certain period of time while they go through whatever sort of regulatory validation processes the FDA may set up for them? I think what everybody's worried about, because so many people are reliant on LDTs now, is that the FDA will issue a regulation. It will go into effect almost immediately, and it will shut down a lab's ability to perform those LDTs until they meet the regulatory requirements that are imposed on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say one that, any proposal that FDA makes is going to have a runway to come into compliance. I don't see them just sort of shutting everything down. I think there's going to be time to come into what they view as compliance. And there'll probably be a lot of discussions during the proposal period about how long that runway should be. That was included in the 2014 proposal. And I think FDA recognizes that they need to include that. Another thing that I would mention, though it's not routinely advertised, is that companies are doing this now under the enforcement discretion model. I've worked with clients in the past who will come to market as an LDT while in parallel pursuing an FDA clearance. And right now there is enforcement discretion with regard to that. And I could see potentially FDA adopting a similar approach where they're going to allow some latitude for time to come into compliance. So I think just based on those sort of that historical experience, seeing labs take that approach when they also wanted to enter the IVD market, and also the 2014 proposal, I expect there to be a runway. I expect it will be in the year to years range. For higher risk tests, FDA is going to want to act more quickly. Moderate risk tests, it'd probably be something in the mid range. And then for low risk tests, you might see limited regulation and a very long runway. So I think it'll all be risk-based. I would say if you're looking at oncology tests and tests that could have a very high impact on morbidity and mortality, you're going to see FDA give you a shorter runway. But I wouldn't say anything less than a year, and I would expect that labs will advocate for much more than that, and it'll probably end up in at least a couple of years, my guess.
Yeah, I think that helps people plan and gives them some basis upon which to think about whether they're going to use an LDT or an IVD when they're doing a direct access test, or whether they're going to use a lab partner to help them do this testing that seems to have the capacity to adjust to the potential increased regulation of the test, right? I mean, those are all things that I think that they have to take into consideration. But it's not going to be like a switch. It's not going to be like one night, all of a sudden you're going to wake up and these thousands of tests that you were performing every month in your laboratory or a partner lab that are LDTs, they're going to get turned off.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. And I think another thing too, as I was thinking through sort of the advocacy piece and keeping an eye on the rule that comes out, is also keeping an eye on Congress and thinking about whether, if you're a stakeholder, makes sense to reach out to your congressperson about these issues. Because one thing that's going to happen as FDA moves forward with regulation is that they're going to need money, right? If you're talking about, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think there are 20,000 labs, probably more, performing LDTs. If you need to run those through an FDA review process, that's going to take reviewers. That's going to take time. You're going to need people to go out and audit. You're going to need all this stuff. They're going to need to build an infrastructure. And I'm sure they'll try and leverage states and they'll try and leverage other groups. But at some point, they're going to need money from Congress. And when Congress gives you money, whether it's through a user fee program or through taking money out of the public fisc to give to an agency, it can come with strings. And that could be in the form of saying, FDA, you need to give these labs 3 years, 4 years to come into compliance, or it could be something else. But I think this will go with FDA. There might be court action. There might be other action, but it's going to come back to Congress at some point, whether that's negotiating a new VALID Act or putting conditions on appropriations bills or something. And that's also another thing I think stakeholders should be thinking about as they consider how to engage on this issue, because it'll probably be all three branches of government getting involved in this one.
There is certainly a lot to watch for in the lab space this year, both from a business and legal and regulatory perspective. Plenty to consider for the lab stakeholders. And, if you are considering a direct access testing model, it will certainly have an impact depending on what is in that rule. So as we're wrapping up, I'm so excited that we've gotten to do this 4-part series. And I want to thank Bob for being a returning guest on every episode of this series and for his insight on the various aspects of the laboratory industry based on his experience. So thank you, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
And of course, thank you to James and to all of our other guests in this direct access test series that have joined us and offered all of their experience.
Happy to be here. And it was a really fun podcast.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's great.
People are laughing at us right now, but
yeah, right. Fun is not what they would say. Right.
Well, and speaking of our listeners, a special thanks to our listeners for hanging with us through this fourth and final episode of the special series. I'm your host, Megan Robertson. If you like what you've heard today, please don't forget to subscribe. Diagnosing Health Care is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare and life sciences, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. This podcast is presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.